You think dictators seize power. You think propaganda looks obvious. You think manipulation feels like manipulation. You think freedom disappears overnight. You think you'd notice the moment everything started going wrong. History tells a different story. Because the most dangerous systems don't begin with violence. They begin with hope. Think about it. No one wakes up one morning and says, "I'd like less freedom today." Nobody asks to be controlled. Nobody volunteers to be manipulated. And yet, throughout history, ordinary people have accepted systems that eventually controlled every part of their lives. Not because they were stupid, not because they were weak, but because the first step never looked dangerous. It looked reasonable. That's the part George Orwell understood better than most. He didn't write Animal Farm simply to criticize one government or one revolution. He exposed a pattern, one that appears whenever people become so focused on building a better future that they stop paying attention to how it's being built. And before we step onto that farm, meet James. James wasn't interested in politics. He wasn't trying to change the world. He simply wanted life to feel fair. He worked hard, paid his bills, trusted the people who promised things would improve. When leaders said, "We're making sacrifices today so everyone can live better tomorrow," James believed them. Not because he was naive, because hope is persuasive, especially when you're tired, especially when life already feels unfair. Maybe you've met someone like James, maybe you've been James. Now imagine one small rule changes. Not a major law, not something shocking, just one tiny adjustment. You're told it's temporary, necessary, for everyone's benefit. Would you fight it? Probably not. Because one small change rarely feels worth starting a conflict over. And that's how almost every system begins. Not with one giant lie, but with 1,000 tiny compromises. Each one too small to notice, too reasonable to question, too ordinary to resist. This is why the opening of Animal Farm is so important. The animals don't begin with hatred. They begin with a dream. A farm where everyone contributes. Everyone benefits. No one exploits anyone else. It's difficult to argue against an idea like that. Because the promise isn't evil. The promise is beautiful. And that's exactly why people embrace it. There's something uncomfortable about human nature. We judge ideas by how they sound, instead of how they behave over time. A promise can feel noble, while quietly creating the conditions for something far more dangerous. The revolution succeeds. The farmer is gone. The animals celebrate. For the first time, they believe the future belongs to them. And for a while, they are right. Work has meaning. Everyone shares responsibility. There is purpose, momentum, optimism. This is the stage history often forgets. Most systems don't begin as nightmares. Many begin with genuine hope. But hope has a blind spot. It makes people less likely to question the people carrying it. Now meet Amina. Unlike James, Amina notices details. She reads everything. She remembers conversations. She pays attention. One afternoon, she notices one of the rules seems different. Not completely different, just slightly different. Maybe she remembered it incorrectly. Maybe someone rewrote it for clarity. Maybe it was always like that. She isn't sure. So she says nothing. That moment matters more than she realizes. Because control doesn't always depend on convincing everyone. Sometimes, it only requires making people doubt themselves. Psychologists call this memory conformity. When enough people confidently repeat a version of events, our own memory begins to feel uncertain. Not because we're irrational, because human beings evolved to trust the group. For most of history, belonging meant survival. Standing alone often meant death. So when everyone around us seems certain, we instinctively question ourselves before we question the crowd. Orwell understood this decades before social media, before 24-hour news cycles, before recommendation algorithms. He understood that whoever controls the story doesn't always need to control reality. Only people's confidence in remembering it. Back on the farm, something subtle is happening. The pigs begin making more decisions. Not because they seize power by force, because everyone else is relieved that someone else is willing to take responsibility. After all, someone has to organize the work. Someone has to make difficult decisions. Someone has to lead. It sounds reasonable. It always does. And that's the first illusion. Power rarely arrives wearing a crown. It arrives carrying a clipboard. It introduces itself as efficiency, as organization, as responsibility, as necessary leadership. By the time people realize leadership has quietly become control, the habit of questioning has already begun to disappear. And what happens next isn't just the turning point of Orwell's story. It's the moment millions of people throughout history have failed to recognize, until it was already too late. If you ask most people how freedom disappears, they'll describe tanks, soldiers, violence, fear. But Orwell suggests something far more unsettling. Freedom usually disappears, one justification at a time. Nobody announces today, we're replacing truth. Instead, truth becomes flexible. And that's where Daniel's story begins. Unlike James, Daniel isn't optimistic. He isn't suspicious either. He's practical. When people around him argue about politics, he stays quiet. When rules change, he assumes someone smarter has probably thought it through. It's not my place. I'm sure there's a reason. They know more than I do. Those sentences sound responsible, but they can also become dangerous. Because history isn't only shaped by people who seek power. It's also shaped by ordinary people who quietly stop asking questions. Back on the farm, the commandments begin to change. Not all at once, one word, one sentence, one tiny adjustment, almost invisible. And every time someone notices, there's an explanation. You remembered it wrong. That's not what "ir" originally meant. The circumstances have changed. It has always been this way. Notice something. The greatest weapon isn't the new rule. It's making people doubt the old one. Because once you stop trusting your own memory, you start borrowing someone else's certainty. Think about how often this happens today. A headline changes. A promise is quietly rewritten. An old statement disappears. A new explanation replaces yesterday's version. Most people don't compare. They move on. Not because they're careless, because life moves fast. Our brains aren't designed to archive every detail. They're designed to save energy. Which means, if someone confidently offers a simpler explanation, we often accept it. Not because it's true, because certainty feels comfortable. This is why propaganda is so powerful. Most people imagine propaganda as loud speeches, dramatic posters, obvious lies. But the most effective propaganda doesn't ask you to believe something ridiculous. It asks you to repeat something until questioning it feels exhausting. Repeat an idea often enough, and eventually, people stop asking whether it's true. They begin asking why anyone would disagree. That's the shift Orwell wanted us to notice. Control isn't strongest when people obey. It's strongest when obedience feels normal. Meanwhile, James keeps working. In fact, he works harder than ever. The more difficult life becomes, the more convinced he is that the answer must be greater effort. If things aren't improving, I just need to do more. Sound familiar? Maybe you've seen it at work. An employee blamed for impossible targets. A student convinced every failure means studying longer. A parent believing exhaustion proves love. Hard work is one of humanity's greatest strengths. But it has a weakness. It can be exploited. That's why Orwell created Boxer. Not as a horse, as a symbol. Boxer's famous response to every problem is painfully simple. I will work harder. At first, it sounds admirable, responsible, even inspiring. But then Orwell quietly asks a devastating question. What happens when the system benefiting from your hard work never intends to reward it? James doesn't notice, because effort has become part of his identity. Every setback confirms only one thing. I need to try harder. Never. Maybe the system itself is broken. Psychologists call this system justification. Human beings often defend systems, even unfair ones, because believing the system is broken creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is frightening. It's emotionally easier to believe, I need to improve, than to believe everything I've trusted may be built on a lie. So people keep adapting, instead of questioning. Back on the farm, something even stranger happens. The pigs stop behaving like the animals they once criticized. They eat differently, sleep differently, live differently. Rules that once applied to everyone no longer apply to them. At first, the contradictions are obvious, then they become familiar. That's another pattern Orwell exposes. Human beings can adapt to almost anything, even unfairness. Not because unfairness becomes acceptable, because repetition makes almost everything feel ordinary. Look around your own life. Think about the subscriptions you forgot to cancel, the notifications that interrupt your day, the extra hours expected at work, the constant feeling of being busy, without remembering why. Most of those changes didn't happen overnight. They accumulated. One tiny adjustment, followed by another, then another, until the abnormal became your normal. That's exactly what happened on the farm. Nobody accepted the final system. On the first day, they accepted the next small step, and then the next one. By the time anyone could clearly see where the path was leading, they had already walked most of it. But Orwell saves his most painful lesson for Boxer, because what happens to Boxer isn't just heartbreaking, it's revealing. He gives everything, his strength, his loyalty, his trust. He believes that when he can no longer serve, The system will finally take care of him. After all, he earned it. He sacrificed for everyone. He never complained. He never rebelled. He did everything he was told. And then, the moment arrives. The moment that should wake everyone up. The moment that should make the animals question everything they've believed. Instead, almost nothing changes. Because by then, the greatest victory wasn't controlling the farm. It was controlling how the farm understood itself. And that's the point where Orwell stops writing about animals and starts writing about us. By now, you've probably realized something. James, Amina, Daniel. They aren't really different people. They are different versions of us. Sometimes we're James. We believe the promise. Sometimes we're Amina. We notice something feels wrong, but convince ourselves there's probably a reasonable explanation. Sometimes we're Daniel. We stay silent because someone else will surely speak first. And that's exactly why Orwell's story still matters. Not because pigs can talk, not because farms become governments, but because human nature hasn't changed. George Orwell wasn't trying to predict one country. He was trying to expose a cycle that begins whenever people stop questioning small compromises. Because every system, good or bad, depends on one thing: what ordinary people are willing to accept. One day at a time. Now think back to Boxer. Most people remember him because of his strength or his loyalty. But those weren't the qualities Orwell wanted us to remember. He wanted us to remember what happened after, when Boxer could no longer work. He believed the promises made to him. He believed that years of sacrifice would be repaid with dignity. Instead, he became useful. One last time. Not as a worker, as a resource. And that's the moment that breaks readers. Because Boxer isn't betrayed by an enemy. He's betrayed by the very system he spent his life protecting. The tragedy isn't that he trusted. The tragedy is that he never imagined trust needed limits. History is full of Boxers. People who believed that if they worked harder, stayed loyal, followed the rules, everything would eventually become fair. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. The danger comes when loyalty replaces judgment, when effort replaces awareness, when obedience replaces thought. That's when good people become the strongest support for bad systems. But Orwell wasn't writing to make us cynical. He wasn't saying every leader is corrupt or every institution is evil. He was asking something much more uncomfortable. What happens when people stop paying attention? Because paying attention feels difficult. That question matters today, more than ever. Every day, someone wants your attention. A politician wants your vote. A company wants your trust. An algorithm wants your time. A headline wants your emotion. A creator wants your belief. Most of them don't begin by asking for everything. They ask for something small. One click. One compromise. One exception. One more hour. One more notification. One more reason not to question. Because that's how habits are built. And that's also how control is built, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. The frightening part about Animal Farm isn't that the animals failed. It's that most of them never realized. When the farm stopped belonging to them. Think about the final commandment. the one that quietly replaced everything the revolution stood for. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. It's an impossible sentence. Logically, it makes no sense. Equality cannot have degrees. Yet by the time those words appeared, almost nobody challenged them. Why? Because contradictions become easier to accept. After years of accepting smaller contradictions, that's how the mind protects itself. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance. When reality conflicts with our beliefs, our brains often change the belief. That requires the least emotional pain. It's easier to explain away the contradiction than to admit we've been deceived. That's why intelligent people can still believe obvious lies. Not because intelligence makes us immune, because intelligence often helps us invent better justifications. And maybe that's Orwell's greatest warning. The greatest threat to freedom isn't ignorance, it's certainty. The certainty that our side could never become the problem. The certainty that our leaders would never abuse power. The certainty that we would notice manipulation before it was too late. History doesn't support that confidence. History whispers something far more unsettling. Every generation believes it is different. Every generation believes it would have resisted. Every generation believes it has learned from the last one. Until the pattern begins again. So, what was Animal Farm really about? Not communism. Not capitalism. Not one country. Not one revolution. It was about a question. A question every generation must answer for itself. How much freedom are you willing to trade? For comfort. For certainty. For someone else to make difficult decisions. Because freedom is rarely stolen all at once. It slowly disappears. Every time responsibility is handed away. Remember James. He thought hope was enough. Remember Amina. She thought someone else would question the changes. Remember Daniel. He believed silence was neutrality. Each of them lost something different. But they all made the same mistake. They assumed someone else was watching. Maybe that's why Orwell ended his novel the way he did. The animals looked from the pigs to the humans and back again until they could no longer tell the difference. It's one of the most chilling endings ever written. Not because the villains won, but because the change happened so gradually that almost nobody noticed until it was complete. Tomorrow, you'll hear someone promise easy solutions. You'll scroll past headlines competing for your certainty. You'll hear people telling you who to trust, who to fear, who to blame. The words may sound convincing. Some of them may even be true. But Orwell's lesson isn't to distrust everyone. It's to never stop thinking for yourself. Because manipulation rarely announces itself. It usually arrives, disguised as convenience, as safety, as progress, as necessity. The question isn't whether you'll ever encounter it. You will. The real question is, will you recognize it before it becomes normal? Because once something feels normal, it becomes incredibly difficult to remember that it was ever different. And maybe that's why Animal Farm has survived for generations. It doesn't tell us what to think. It warns us what happens when we stop.